This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so again, welcome to our NOAA in the Caribbean Community Group meeting. We're going to go ahead and pass it off to our first presenters for today's meeting. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Chip Conrad and Dr. Chris Furman. So Chip is the director and Chris is the deputy director and regional climatologist for the Southeast Regional Climate Center. Their presentation today is titled Using a Web-Based Tool to Forecast Local Variations in Wet Bulb Globe Temperature Across Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So, Chris, I'm going to give you screen sharing permissions, or you should be able to share your screen now, Chris, and then I can pass it off to you, Chip, to get started.
Okay, let's see, let me get it in presentation mode. Let me know if that's working.
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, first off, it's really great to be here. It's wonderful to see a couple familiar faces. So we're going to talk today about wet bulb globe temperature. Try to say that really quickly. It's hard. We're going to talk about what it is, but before we do that, we're going to say some things. And Chris, why don't you go to the next slide here? Yep, I should say some things about our center. So I direct the NOAA-funded Southeast Regional Climate Center. So there's 6 centers scattered out across the country. You can see there in the bottom right the footprint for our center. And so, of course, our area includes Puerto Rico and also the Virgin Islands. So we carry out a wide variety of climate services for the region. And we really serve as a hub. We have very close connections with the state climatologists in the region and also close connections with various federal partners. Next slide. Okay, so in this talk, I want to start off with a sort of a brief background on some of the heat research that we've done here at the CERC. We've been in this space now for, depending on maybe 14 years now. And a lot of our focus, of course, has been in the lower 48 states, but especially here in North Carolina. And so I'm just going to show you some of the findings that we've had in terms of identifying heat vulnerability in North Carolina. I'll briefly mention some of the factors that are behind these patterns that make communities vulnerable. And then we'll go into kind of a deep dive into wet bulb globe temperature. And then I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to give a presentation of our tool and a demo on how to use it. Next. Okay, so kind of just as a summary of sort of some of the work that we've done, we've really gotten down literally on the ground level and measured wet bulb globe temperature. So we're very interested in the meteorological and the climatological characteristics of extreme heat and wet bulb globe in particular. You see the pictures over there on the right. So we've measured wet bulb globe temperature with multiple sensors, including the Kestrels, which cost about $500, that a lot of high schools now are using to measure it. We actually had also an actual wet bulb globe thermometer that we borrowed from Andy Grunstein at the University of Georgia, and that I think cost him over $3,000. And then there's a weather station that you see on a tower there in the background. We've done lots of presentations on wet bulb globe temperature, a lot of these to audiences related to athletics. We have very close connection, for example, with the North Carolina High School Athletic Association. And so with all this we've learned, that's helped us build this tool that predicts wet bulb globe temperature. Next slide. Okay, so how do we look at heat vulnerability in North Carolina? Well, we got this incredible data set. It's called NC Detect, North Carolina Disease Event Tracking and Epidemiologic Collection Tool. And we were able to get from that, it's basically a syndromic surveillance system that basically tagged every single visit to the emergency room across the state, excepting military and Native American hospitals. And there's a few of those. So it's like 99.99% of emergency room visits. And we were able to get the age, gender, billing address, county, the billing address, zip code, for every single person who went to the emergency room, and that we got data, and this has been updated a couple of times. Our original data was from 2017 or 2007 to 2012, and it was updated to 2017, and then it was more recently updated. And basically, we acquired all ED visits with the particular code for primary and secondary diagnostic codes. So these are codes that relate to some form of heat illness. And then we linked each visit to daily maximum temperature and later on heat index, and also ultimately wet bulb globe temperature to identify relationships. Next. And so this is a map here that shows the patterns that we found here. And this is at the ZICTA level. ZICTAs are parts of census blocks and so forth that are tagged to zip codes. And so it's really, we haven't seen anything more spatially granular than this. And what really pops out here is that there's a lot of variability in wet bulb globe temperature. The red areas show high areas. And immediately you can look at this with your geographic eye and begin to spot some patterns. The big one, I think the obvious one is that you see the hotter colors more in the coastal plain of North Carolina. If you know anything about the state, you know it's the eastern parts, and it's particularly the southeastern parts of the state that are the warmest and are also the most humid. And so that's as sort of a first order, you know, that describes the pattern a bit. But if you look at the coastal plain, you see again that there's a lot of variability here. And it turns out through work done by Maggie Sugg several years ago, she identified a number of factors that control these rates. And a huge one was simply labor-intensive agriculture. So she found that a lot of these areas where you see the red are areas in which there's a lot of agriculture in North Carolina. A lot of that is produce, maybe blueberries in particular. There's also still some tobacco that's grown in the state, and there's periods during the tobacco growing season that are really labor intensive. And so that shows a lot right there. And so it's very much something that happens in rural areas. And what's interesting is that, you know, most of the work on heat, of course, has been conducted in urban areas where we have the urban heat island and we have concentrations of population. But when we normalize this by the number of people living there, the rates are on the order of 8 to 10 times higher in some of these rural areas as compared to the urban areas. And I showed some black circles there indicating some of the bigger cities across North Carolina, and almost all of those are situated in the dark blue or the light blue colors. There's a little bit of variation you can't see on this map in those areas, but anyway, huge correlation with rural populations. Next. Okay, and so what we found was that there's a very strong relationship, as you can imagine, between the temperature and the number of ED visits. And basically, you know, it's a positive relationship. So we'll just look at heat index there. What was really peculiar was that we found that there was a peak that you go beyond a certain temperature, and it seemed that the rates of heat illness went down. That's particularly the case with maximum temperature. When Maggie showed that to me the first time, I said, I think there's a mistake with your code. You should go back and look at it. But the reality is it's true. And so it turns out that perhaps National Weather Service forecasts are useful when it gets really hot and when heat warnings are issued, or it's just sometimes common sense when it gets really, really hot, then people don't go outside. And so they take precautions. Next slide. Another thing we found is that there's a peak in heat illness rates between the ages of basically 18 and 44 years of age, and this peakness was especially high in rural areas. Don't have time to go in the details of it, but the blue bars there, the blue and the red and the green represent areas that are the most rural, and that's where it peaks, and it peaks in this area. And we'll go to the next slide. And we see that the peak is much, much greater, on the order of 3 times greater for males than it is for females. And so this points again to people on farms, you know, that are picking produce or working in tobacco or that sort of thing. It's predominantly male, so it's higher. We recognize too, you know, these are people that actually went to the emergency room. A lot of males don't go to the emergency room, not very smart there. and some not nearly as smart as females. But I guess the short of what I'm getting at is this rate we're sure is much higher than what we're showing here. Next slide. Okay, so let's segue now to wet bulb globe temperature. And you know, we're all familiar with heat index, which is commonly used to warn people of the heat, particularly in the eastern, at least the eastern 3/4 of the country. But there's other meteorological factors that affect heat stress. And again, heat index takes into account the humidity, but wet bulb globe temperature, in addition to air temperature and humidity, takes into account the wind speed and also the solar radiation. So it matters, you know, you're out in the sun or in the shade, that plays a big role there, okay? And in the formulation of wet bulb globe temperature, there's something called the black, basically it's the black globe temperature, and it's weighted about 20% there to account for the radiative influences. And it's very important to mention that it's not just short wave, you know, coming in from the sun, but it's also infrared radiation that's coming from the surface. And so this really comes to the fore in urban areas. In an urban landscape, you have surfaces that are very hot, especially, of course, surfaces that are exposed to the sun. And so the radiation comes up from those surfaces, and that's going to make it feel hotter here. Okay, next slide. So high school athletic associations in the Southeast, and I think most of the states now, there's a few exceptions, Virginia being one of them, but most states now, the athletic associations require the measurement of wet bulb globe temperature by the practice field. This is especially the case for football, and they have these guidelines for wet bulb globe temperature. In this example here, and this is for North Carolina, black flag conditions are identified when the wet bulb globe temperature exceeds 90 degrees. And if the wet bulb globe temperature is between 88 and 90 degrees, it's called red flag. But anyway, when it's black flag, they're not allowed to have practice at all. If it's red flag, there's very close supervision. Football players have to take off their pads and equipment. There's frequent water breaks and so forth. And so it turns out there's guidelines. These guidelines, they vary across the states somewhat. Some of the other southeastern states have the black flag at 92 degrees. Chris, if you go to the next slide. And this sort of shows it here. This is recommendations from a study that was done several years ago, but it shows basically recommendations for classes of recommendations. And so if you look at the map there in the bottom right, you can see the southern parts, the southeastern and southern parts of the state. You see the darkest shade there, so that's class 3. That actually would be a cutoff of 92 degrees. And then you see, of course, the brighter red and then the yellow. This was just one study. A lot more research needs to be done on this. These are just recommendations for states basically setting up their recommendations. Next. And so we've developed some really granular climatologies of wet bulb globe temperature. This particular map here just shows the average number of days with at least 1 hour of black flag conditions. And you can see here the hottest colors there, that you see this in interior parts of Florida, and then going up basically through southern Alabama and Mississippi. If you look real close, it's very interesting. Along the coastal areas, the average number of days is markedly lower, and this relates to wind. Okay, and so wind is a huge factor that controls wet bulb globe temperature. And I'm going to show you, I'm just going to give you an example out here in a second. But of course, we have the sea breeze that sets up along the coast. We also, if there's an onshore flow of air, the wind has a very strong fetch. So it's much breezier, and so it gives a ventilating effect. And so that very much drives down the wet bulb globe temperature. So in short, it's interior areas close to the coast are the areas in which you see the most dangerous conditions the most frequently. Next. Okay, what we have found in our research, however, is that there's a lot of really localized variability. In the map here on the right, each circle there denotes an ASOS station. And of course, we have a lot of them in the Southeast, and the coloration there shows basically the 95th percentile daily max WBGT. And if you look at just say the darkest reds, that would be the highest values of 97 to 100, 102. You see some of those even up in the northern parts of the region, places that are climatologically cooler. And so this has a lot to do with the landscape around the ASOS station, and just generally even away from weather stations. If we look, let's say, for example, at urban areas, so surface type, you know, asphalt and concrete, say, versus artificial turf versus natural grass, we have found through our field work that there's real differences. And I say real differences, there can be whole flag level differences going from one to the other, sometimes 2 flag level differences. Another factor, of course, is a rather obvious one, the amount of shade, the degree of cloud cover. It's challenging to forecast wet bulb globe temperature in the summertime because of the pop-up showers and thunder showers that are not well forecasted. It's particularly passing clouds, so wet bulb globe temperature can vary over the course of an hour by several degrees, sometimes more than several degrees, just from clouds passing over. And then very importantly, the openness of the landscape. How rough is it? So enclosed landscapes where there's lots of trees or buildings nearby, it really slows the winds down, and that really drives up the wet bulb globe temperature. Open areas, in contrast, few trees or buildings, you get somewhat more of a breeze, and so the wet bulb globe temperature goes down a bit. Next. And so this is a plot here. I don't have time to go in the details of it, but it just shows you the flag levels there and wet bulb globe temperature there in the vertical. You can see the black flag up towards the top there. And we'll just look at the red line there. This is for conditions in which there's no cloud cover. And these are conditions that are somewhat below what we've been experiencing lately. So this just be conditions in which you have an air temperature of 86, a dew point of 70. Okay, so very normal, even slightly below normal temperatures. 2 stars there show that under these conditions, and if you're out in the sun, it's a sunny day, the wind speed is 3 miles an hour, that puts you in yellow flag. And then we go along the red line though, if the wind speed goes down to 1 mile an hour, that puts us all the way up into black flag conditions. So what this shows here is that subtle variations in wind speed on days that are sunny, these subtle variations in wind speed can play a really big role, particularly on days that are already rather hot and humid. Wind speed can make all the difference there in the world. Next. So we've done field work on this, as I suggested earlier. We've focused our attention on high school campuses, particularly looking at athletic fields. And real quickly, I just wanted to show you a contrast. On the left here, we have Ashley High School at Carolina Beach, North Carolina. Google map there, it's of course a flat landscape. There's relatively few trees. As a crow flies, it's less than a mile from the beach. It's a breezy place, particularly in the afternoons when they do fall sports and so forth. On most days, there's a very good breeze that's blowing through there. Contrast that with Cedar Ridge High School in Hillsborough, North Carolina. This is in the Piedmont of North Carolina. This is about 130 miles to the northwest, in an area that climatologically speaking would be markedly cooler. And what we found is that with this high school in Hillsborough, it is situated in the Piedmont, and the practice field is down in a pit. And beside the pit are 2 low-lying areas that when it's rather wet out, they're wetlands. This is a moist area. It's nearly surrounded by trees. It's down at the bottom of a hill. It is extremely sheltered. And so there have been just exceedingly high values of wet bulb globe temperature measured there before. And when we talked to the athletic director who's tasked with making the measurements, you know, she shared right in the beginning of the conversation, she thought her instrument was broken. She said, I'm getting wet bulb globe temperatures in the upper 90s, and I know that's way too high. But anyway, we measured that and confirmed it. And so anyway, this is just a very vivid example where the local conditions matter greatly. Next. And so I'm almost out of time, but I'm just going to show you a slide here real quickly. We did a citizen science study. It's really a pilot study in the medical district in Charleston, South Carolina. You see slides here where we had citizen scientists measuring wet bulb globe temperature with the Kestrel in different locations. Notice that there's 2 there that are on artificial turf And we have found that the coloration of the turf made some difference in the wet bulb globe temperature. So the turf that was lighter colored, that was maybe more bleached by the sun, was actually slightly cooler than the newer artificial turf that was darker. So subtle differences in the albedo and the reflectivity made a difference. Next slide. And so this just shows the medical district there and just places where wet bulb globe temperature was measured and averaged. It was a pretty limited sample, but this kind of gives you an idea. I would ignore the yellow there, the 76.9. That was only one observation, and there were some clouds around. But basically, measurements of wet bulb globe temperature from the mid 80s upwards to the mid 90s. So 10-degree difference in wet bulb globe temperature. Some of this is dictated by the weather. We were unable to do this in a real systematic way, but at any rate, it really gives you a flavor for how much local scale variation you can get. Next. We found a lot of complexity here too, things we weren't even considering. In this Google map here, we have in Charleston, they have the sea breeze that almost always comes in from the south-southwest, hitting buildings and setting up rotors that would cause the wind to move down and create decent, really significant breezy conditions down at the surface. And then there are areas in the wake of buildings, places in which there was less wind, and there'd be like the wet bulb globe temperature would be several degrees warmer. So a lot of complexity in terms of wind flow in an urban landscape, and that plays a significant role. Next. And so this is the time that I turn it over to Chris, and he's going to talk about the wet bulb globe temperature prediction tool.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chip. So yeah, I'm going to provide a demonstration of our WBGT prediction tool. The link to the tool is there on the slide, but I've also included it in the chat. So feel free to open it up, play around with it, or bookmark it for later. So first, just a few technical aspects of the tool. It ingests hourly gridded data and uses it to initialize forecasts from the National Weather Service to estimate wet bulb globe temperature. The current version of the tool covering the eastern 2/3 of the US uses forecast grids from the National Digital Forecast Database as well as the National Blend of Models, and that's a 2.5 kilometer resolution. However, because of differences in map projection, the domain covering Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands provides forecasts of WBGT at 1.25 kilometer resolution, which is great. To calculate a WBGT forecast, the tool incorporates air temperature, humidity, dew point temperature, pressure, wind speed that's been downscaled from 10 meters to 2 meters, as well as cloud cover and solar position. Now, it's important to note that the tool uses the physically based model developed by Liljegren et al. To calculate WBGT, and that's different from the statistically based model used by the National Weather Service and has actually been shown through research conducted by our center to be more accurate than the statistically based model, especially at higher WBGT values. So just a little history of the tool. It was originally developed for the Carolinas back in 2018 and was expanded to cover the eastern 2/3 of the US in May of 2022. We added a menu of flag level guideline options later that summer, and we continue to update those as new ones become available. And of course, the reason we're here today is that earlier this year, we added Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands to the tool. The tool itself generates a 5-day forecast of WBGT anywhere across the forecast domain, and I'm going to walk through that process here on the next few slides. The homepage of the tool, which I'm showing here on the right, also provides background information on WBGT, as well as guidance on how to use the tool and interpret the output, and also how to contact us if you have any questions or feedback. Okay, so first, if you go to the main web page, you'll see the domain over the continental US, which is outlined in white here on the Google Map interface. To go to the Caribbean domain, just click the button highlighted in red there in the upper left, and it will take you to the Caribbean domain, which is outlined in white. And as you can see, we have forecast grids obviously covering the main island there of Puerto Rico, but also the outlying islands as well as all of the US Virgin Islands. So to select the location where you want to generate a forecast, we have several options. First, at the top of the Google map, you'll see a text bar where you can begin typing in the name of your location, and it will auto-populate with options matching that location. Here, you can see we've typed in San Juan, and it gives us several options, which we can then select. Also, if we know the coordinates of our location, we can type those in as well in the text box shown there. Or, and this is probably the most common method, you can simply click on the Google map, which will display the coordinates in the text bar, and will pull the variables from the associated grid cell. Here I've selected the location around the Medical Sciences campus at the University of Puerto Rico in San Juan, and I'll show some examples of that here in a second. So now that I've selected my location, I need to select the flag level guidelines, which is done at the bottom of the Google map. The current menu of flag level guidelines is shown there on the right. Most official guidelines, as Chip mentioned, have been developed by high school athletic associations, though there are some that are specific to other vulnerable populations, such as the military, pediatrics, and marathon runners. As Chip showed earlier, the National Weather Service has also adopted a set of regional guidelines that were developed by the Corey Stringer Institute, and they correspond to regional variations in those climatological extreme WBGT values that Chip showed. These regional guidelines were only developed, though, for the continental United States, though we believe that Region 3, which covers the southern tier of the U.S., as Chip showed, may be most applicable to the Caribbean. So after selecting the flag level guidelines, I can then select which model run I want to use. The tool will default to the most recent model, though the user has the option to select any model run over the previous 5 days. And this could be useful if you want to assess any trends in the models over time. Currently, forecast runs are generated at 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. And so once I've selected my model run, I hit submit there at the bottom. And after just a second or two, a forecast chart is generated at the bottom of the page, which shows the model WBGT over the prior 24 hours. That's the part of the chart there that's shaded there on the far left side. And it also shows the forecasted WBGT superimposed on the selected flag level guidance over the next 5 days. And so what's nice is if you mouse over the chart, a text box will pop up showing the forecasted WBGT for that particular hour, as well as the estimated WBGT value in full sun and shade. The range in values from full sun to full shade is illustrated by the light gray shaded region there on the chart. And as Chip mentioned, this information could be especially useful when planning outdoor activities, as it shows how flag levels may change if you're able to access a shaded space. Now, below the forecast chart, you will find the activity guidelines that were selected. In this case, the forecast for the next day at the Medical Sciences campus in San Juan, that location we selected earlier, was for yellow flag conditions around midday. That's shown by the black line there at the top. However, in the shade, the flag level drops to green flag conditions. That's shown by the gray line there. Now, I should also mention when you look at this chart that the current version of the tool produces hourly forecasts of WBGT for the first 36 hours of the forecast period, and then it produces a forecast every 3 hours for the remainder of the forecast period. Okay, so let's look at how the selection of flag level guidelines influences the WBGT forecast. So here I've selected a rural community on the outskirts of San Juan, and I've generated a forecast using the Region 3 guidelines as we did on the prior slide. And it shows green flag conditions for much of the forecast periods, though that drops to no flag conditions actually if individuals can access shade, particularly during the morning or the late afternoon periods. Now, instead of using Region 3 guidelines, here I've selected the thresholds set by the American Academy of Pediatrics, which, as you can see, are much lower than the thresholds for nearly all other flag level guidelines. The forecasted WBGT values are the same, but notice how the corresponding flag levels on the forecast chart have changed rather dramatically. Now the forecast calls for black flag conditions, which according to the guidelines would force the cancellation of all outdoor activities, except for maybe a few hours in the early morning and late evening. Okay, so just to summarize, wet bulb globe temperature is an increasingly used measure of heat stress that accounts for numerous meteorological variables. Regional patterns of wet bulb globe temperature reflect these variations in things like latitude, elevation, proximity to coastlines. And as Chip showed, WBGT shows much local variation that relates primarily to wind speed, but also relates to shade, variations in shade and cloud cover. And as I'm highlighting here, and what we'd love to discuss with you all is work that's needed to determine the most appropriate flag levels for populations in the US Caribbean. We also have a number of projects underway looking at improving some of the estimations of things like wind speed and sky conditions, as well as conducting field work to measure and model WBGT at very high resolution in both urban and rural areas. We're also working with colleagues at West Point Academy as well as at Kent State University to examine whether WBGT is a good predictor of mortality in cities across the US. We're also interested in linking WBGT with other types of health data sets and vulnerability indicators, though there are limitations to some of these approaches, and we'd be happy to talk more with you all and find ways to collaborate with folks here in the group who have interest and expertise in these areas. We really want to learn and understand how WBGT can be used to address heat risk in the region. So with that, we greatly appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate the tool and talk with you all about WBGT in the Caribbean. We also want to acknowledge our many partners and funding sources that have supported and continue to support this work. And we're happy if there's time to take any questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thank you, Chip. Really appreciate it. We do have some time for questions. I went over a little bit when opening our meeting today. So if folks have questions, you can take them now. Yeah, I have. Spectre, you should be able to come off mute.
Hi, this is Hector Jimenez from the Puerto Rico Climate Office. Thank you very much, Chris and Chip, for that presentation. We're extremely interested in moving forward into wet bulb globe temperature measurement and maybe ground truthing to some degree. We're creating from scratch a wet bulb globe thermometer here as a student project at the university that we want to use to start making comparisons with tools like the ones that you're presenting. I'm particularly interested in the ability of the forecast model to deal with the black globe temperature. Because it is a very complex thing. It has to do with solar angle, shading, the kind of surface that you have, and the winds. So to the degree that the model has or doesn't have access to the surface characteristics of the place, the wind speed, the difference in wind speed can vary dramatically. And I think Chip showed very clearly that can send you over two levels all at once. So I'm very interested in this. I'm sure that there's a lot that needs to be done over the next few years, but we want to be part of it. I have some students working on it. I have a box right here behind me, where we're doing it from scratch, 3 identical thermometers. And one of them, we're going to put a wicker on it. We're going to make it actually wet. And the other one, we're going to put it inside a black bulb. So we want to use that around. So I would like to see how we can maybe work together so that we can provide some useful feedback for the tool and for other things.
Okay, well, I mean, first off, I just really applaud the old school approach there, building and using a wet bulb globe thermometer. I love it. I think part of your question, I think an integral part of this has to do with spatial resolution, right? And the models, and we're looking at the national blend of models here for Puerto Rico, which I think Chris said goes down to it's 1.25 kilometers. And within 1.25 kilometer grid box, let's say in San Juan or any place, there's going to be a lot of variation. And it's our experience. Indeed, I showed you some examples like in Charleston, wet bulb globe temperature can vary a lot on scales of meters. And so I think that, and we should definitely talk offline, and we're happy to work with you. But I think that we need to be thinking about the range of wet bulb globe temperature that can occur in a given pixel, and that we identify places that are, say in the sunlight, that have been exposed, where there tends to be no wind, the prevailing winds there, they're sheltered, and identify those places as being exceedingly dangerous places, while there might be other places, and certainly are other places that are much cooler, but to really look at that really localized variation in WBGT and then make some association then with the prediction of the wet bulb flow temperature provided by the model, so that you could tell people, well, it could be as high as this, or if you can find the appropriate place, in your area, it could be as low as that. So anyway, to kind of go to a range, to look at it in terms of range there. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
That was great. I think that covered everything. That was great, Chip.
That's good. One more thing, if I may add, is that it would be nice if we could find a way to reduce the number of different standards, because right now it's challenging, because there being so many of them, and everyone has moved ahead and created their own. I think in the future it would be nice if we could start creating some sort of consensus about what it is, because right now it seems like I can go from okay conditions to dangerous conditions by just changing which standard I choose, so that's also, I think, a bit of a challenge in order to also sell the product to the stakeholders, because it may seem to some like it's kind of arbitrary right now which standards we're going to pick.
Right, and I'm going to say here too that Chris was recommending, the region that corresponds to the southern U.S. Naturally, you think that would correspond to Puerto Rico, but that is for football players, and that very importantly is for protocols that have been established there for healthy athletes taking very frequent water breaks and so forth. As we know, the average person is not necessarily going to be in the best of shape and aren't necessarily taking frequent water breaks. And what I'm getting at is, I think that the wet bulb globe temperature guidelines need to be much lower than say, a black flag of 92. And I've told people informally, that the American Pediatric Society, their guidelines, I think, are somewhat more appropriate. But you bring up, a huge question. We need to get on the same page. And very importantly, we need to be doing research with human subjects on this. And we need to be recognizing too that a lot of people are compromised a lot of people are really, really vulnerable to the heat. And we need to be looking very much at that population. Yeah, good point.
Thank you very much. It's great work.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Hector, and thanks so much, Chip and Chris. I do want to move on to our next presentation, so that way folks here on the call time for announcements and updates at the end. Chip, Chris, we did get a question here in the chat from Harvey. If you want to take a look and answer there in the chat. If not, Harvey, please do follow up with Chris and Chip via email. So with that, Charlie, I'm going to go ahead and move screen sharing permissions over to you. And while you're getting set up, I'll introduce you to the group. So I'm really happy to welcome Charlie Gogan today. He's a geodeticist from NOAA's National Geodetic Survey, and his presentation today is titled NOAA's National Geodetic Survey in the Caribbean. So Charlie, thanks so much for being here. Your screen looks great, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you to present.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Thanks for inviting me here today. Probably many of you have not heard of the National Geodetic Survey. We're kind of a small group in NOAA, probably about 180 employees altogether, full-time employees. Hopefully by the end of this, you will have some idea of what we do. I am the Mid-Atlantic advisor for NGS, and my job is to kind of reach out and help people with the work that we do, and let's just go ahead and get into it. NGS, if you looked up, did a Google search for NGS, you'd come up with different things: next generation sequencing, National Geographic Society, National Geological Society, and you might even come up with the U.S. Geological Survey. Well, we're none of those, and we're especially not the U.S. Geological Survey. However, the U.S. Geological Survey does use our data, as you'll see as we get a little bit further into the presentation. We've got a long history, starting back with Thomas Jefferson in 1807. He realized that at the time that when the British left, they took a lot of their charts with them. I think they were just being poor sports, and realized that for commerce, we were having a lot of shipwrecks in the harbors along the coastlines, and realized that we needed to come up with our own charting system. So he went through some dealings with Congress at the time and finally came up with Ferdinand Hassler as the first superintendent of the Survey of the Coast. Hassler was a Swiss immigrant who had quite extensive experience in his home country of triangulation, positioning points on the ground. So he was kind of hired to do that job. Didn't really get started until probably the 1830s. A lot of time lapsed before they really dug into it and started making progress. By that time, he was into his 60s, but still a very active man. Later, we changed in 1836 to the U.S. Coast Survey, and then by 1878, there was a realization that we needed to do land surveying as well as surveying the coasts, the east and the west coast. We needed to tie them together. So that's where they came up with the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. In fact, as part of the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, the superintendent was in charge of the standards also. And that was because Ferdinand Hassler had brought over the weights and measures with him when he immigrated to the United States. So he already had all the tools. 1970, there was a major reorganization, and the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey changed to the National Ocean Service, and all of the parts of it were broken down. There was a National Geodetic Survey, the Office of the Coast Survey, co-ops, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and there were 5 others. I'm not saying that they're less important. I'm just saying that I didn't have room to put them all in there. In 1800, we needed something to, like I said, to replace the charts that the British took with them. You can see here an aerial view of Manhattan. New York Harbor was very busy at the time, and there were a lot of shipwrecks going on, and that affected commerce greatly. So they came up with these surveys of the coast, began that. If you go to our current web page, you'll see where to get to the area of where I work, the geodetic advisors, just go down to about NGS, geodetic advisors, and you'll see me. This is my glamour shot. There are 14 geodetic advisors throughout the United States. I'm in the Mid-Atlantic region, which includes 6 states: Washington, D.C., the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Now, in Puerto Rico, and in the Virgin Islands, we have what we call geodetic coordinators. They're basically liaisons between the people in those areas and NGS. And it's very important that we have a local perspective on the needs of the people in these areas. So that's what the geodetic coordinator does. In Puerto Rico, it's Linda Rodriguez. She's a University of Puerto Rico, or was a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and she's retired, but she still retained the position of coordinator. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, there's Chris George. He's from the Office of the Lieutenant Governor. He's just recently joined us as the coordinator there. So anybody that has questions about geodesy or geodetic control in these areas, feel free to contact these people. They're on our webpage also. Moving on, we get down to our current mission of the National Geodetic Survey is to define, maintain, and provide access to a very special system called the National Spatial Reference System to meet our nation's economic, social, and environmental needs. that covers a lot of areas. So, but one of the basic things that we do is with the NSRS, the National Spatial Reference System, it basically is a consistent coordinate system, and it serves as the foundation that underpins a lot of other mapping type work. The consistent coordinate system is required to be used by all federal civilian agencies. Any federal agency that deals in geospatial data is required to use the National Spatial Reference System, which consists of these 6 major components: latitude and longitude, height, scale, gravity, and orientation. Now, most of us have heard of latitude and longitude, but we're going to talk a little bit more about height and some of the other things that affect the National Spatial Reference System. These are areas that actually hit pretty hard with the National Spatial Reference System. Right now, we're talking precision agriculture. A lot of farmers actually have GPS equipment mounted to their farm machinery for location purposes. Aviation, very important. Satellite operations. Trucking and shipping, again, we're back to commerce. Survey and mapping. A lot of our users are surveyors and mappers. Disaster response, we actually have a portion of our group that's called a division that's called remote sensing. And whenever there's a disaster, they provide the images of the disaster for the people who are responding to the disaster. Personal navigation, most everybody's got some kind of navigator on their cell phone. CORS, continuously operating reference stations. We'll talk more about that. Navigation, oil exploration, fishing and boating, and all of these things are tied some way to the National Spatial Reference System. They're underpinned by it. The main components are the North American datum of 1983. It's a 3D coordinate system consisting of latitude, longitude, and ellipsoidal height. Talk some more about that. Puerto Rico has got a vertical datum, and it's called PRVD02. It provides orthometric height, or what we commonly refer to as elevations. The U.S. Virgin Islands has their own vertical datum, BIVD 809. Again, the elevations are tied to a vertical datum that is specific to these islands. Now let's put it all together. First off, we have to, in order to model the Earth and start off with some kind of system to base the spatial system on, we've got to start off with an ellipsoid. And this is the GRS 80, the Geodetic Reference System of 1980. And it basically defines roughly the shape of the Earth. It's a best fit model and very, very close to actually WGS 84. And with that, we have then a coordinate system that is attached to that. And the current one is North American datum of 1983. So we have coordinates that are assigned to the ellipsoid, and that's the datum. And then the third part of it is the actual surface of the Earth that we live on, the ground, what we do our business on. And we got to have that. Now, this all is kind of complex, but it doesn't get, it really gets complex when we start talking about the geoid. The geoid is a physical surface. It's based on gravity measurements. And this is roughly just a depiction. Of course, it's exaggerated, but it's a depiction of what the gravity field is like in the world. And this is a very important component of vertical datums, especially the new ones that are going to be coming out. The vertical datum surface approximates a geoid surface. Now, the geoid surface is an equal potential surface, which means that if you spill water anywhere on this model, it will spread out evenly in all directions. So let's kind of put all this together and see what we come up with. So we've got ellipsoid heights. Ellipsoid heights are the height from a point on the Earth's surface down to the geoid surface, or the ellipsoid surface, which is GRS 80. Then we got geoid height, which is the difference in height between the geoid model and the ellipsoid. Now, if you combine those two, you'll come up with the orthometric height. Orthometric height basically will determine which way water flows. So all these things work together. Ellipsoid heights are generated generally nowadays with GPS or GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems. When you collect data with these instruments, you'll get longitude, latitude, and ellipsoid heights. But you can't use the ellipsoid height, of course, as elevations. So you have to apply that little bit of geoid height between there. And we've got the geoid models that will tell you, will enable you to go from an ellipsoid height to an orthometric height, which is the most useful type of elevation height. So here's the basic formula for it. Your orthometric height is equal to your ellipsoid height minus the geoid height. Geoid height usually is a negative, so basically it's adding those two components together. Moving on, we've got we'll just talk a little bit about the Puerto Rico vertical datum. It's accessed now using benchmarks, and in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see one of the benchmarks that's established in Puerto Rico. This is actually in San Juan. I've got a little clip from our data sheet that describes this mark and gives you the information about the mark. Now, this would be for any of the marks that you might have in our database in Puerto Rico. You can see that it has an NAD 83 position, latitude and longitude in degrees, minutes, and seconds. And you can see also that it has an ellipsoid height of a minus 27.367. The epic date was 2010, and we can talk a little bit more about what an epic date is. And our orthometric height, 15.847. And down below, you see the geoid height, which is 43. The geoid height. So if you combine the ellipsoid height and the geoid height, you'll come up with approximately what the orthometric height is. The orthometric height in this case was determined by GPS. So you can see the equipment set up on the mark there. And that's how most of the vertical datums are accessed nowadays, whether it be the continental United States, NAVD 88, or the two that I talked about in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The horizontal datum, NAD 83, is accessed via the NOAA CORS network. The NOAA CORS network consists of about 1,750 continuously operating reference stations. They cover 31 countries. There are over 10 different tectonic plates worldwide. 40 of the NOAA CORS network monuments are on the Caribbean plate. So here's kind of a breakdown of where you can find these continuously operating reference stations. There's 11 in Puerto Rico, 7 in the Dominican Republic. We've got 3 in Martinique, Trinidad and Tobago, U.S. Virgin Islands, 2 in Marinda, Antigua and Barbuda, Nicaragua, St. Lucia, and then we have 1 in each of the 7 islands down below there, Honduras and El Salvador, Central America. So you can see we're kind of spread out down through there, and we're able to monitor all these areas with these continuously operating reference stations. And what does that give us? Over time, we're able to detect the motion, and not only the motion, but the velocity at which the plates are moving. And here I've got a blow up of the Caribbean plate, and you can see the direction that it's moving based on and not only the direction, but the annual rate of movement over time per year. This is, if you're working on a plate by itself, you won't notice that type of motion, but this is how it is with respect to global reference frames. Vertical land motion and sea level observations, if we look at those individually, we may not get the full picture. So NGS uses the NOAA CORS network to detect local horizontal movement and vertical land motion. Vertical land motion, we're able to detect subsidence or uplift. Now these are with the CORS. Over time, we can get local and vertical velocities, and this which enables us to determine in the past or the future where a point might have been. Then we, a sister organization, we have Co-op's Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services, operate a number of tide gauges around the U.S. and the world. And they're also responsible for the National Tidal Datum Epic and local tidal datums. Just to illustrate here, there's a tide gauge in St. John, and this is kind of what it looks like. If you go to their site, you'll be able to find this information about this tide station and what it is able to do. In this next slide, you'll see the result of the National Tidal Datum Epic. In this case, we're basing this one on the 1983 to 2001 tidal epic. And they're fixing to come up with a new tidal epic after 2026. But this gives you an idea of where the Virgin Islands vertical datum plays into the tide datums. Now, this is all well and good, but how does that help us? Well, if we combine the vertical land motion that we're able to detect with the CORS with the tide gauges, and you'll notice that the tide gauge is on the end of a pier, as it was in the photograph I just showed you, and the tide gauge is measuring the sea level, but also the tide gauge is mounted on a surface that may not be very stable. So if we look at what might happen over time, we got some sea level rise. If you're familiar with with how you gauge the wetlands, we put down a horizon marker, and then we can see that we had in this illustration we had the wetland surface subsided. The horizontal marker went down, and at the same time, we've had some surface accretion. So we've had some height added to on top of the horizon marker. And so now we've got to try to measure that with the surface elevation table instrument. And the surface elevation instrument is mounted on a rod that's driven down to what we hope is a solid surface, one that doesn't move. And when we do that, then we can tie these all together. The tide gauge, the surface elevation table, the rod it's mounted on, and also the benchmarks that we have on the land that are also, we're able to determine the vertical velocity of those, the vertical motion. Using CORS. So we got the depth of the set measurement, that's the integrated. We hope it's driven down to a point where it's not going to move. So this is, again, shallow subsidence, the wetlands area. But again, we also have what's known as deep subsidence. So even though that rod may be driven as far down as we could drive it, we're still, and we've experienced areas where we have this deep subsidence. So we actually have the rod that the surface elevation table is set on has actually moved either up or down. It could be uplift. In a lot of the coastal areas, it's mostly subsidence right now. So what do we measure this to? How do we know what's moving and what's not moving? And that's where the NOAA CORS network comes in. We're able to relate all of that information to the benchmark systems, and then we can monitor actually what's happening with sea level rise, and separate that out from any motion that the land is experiencing. That kind of wraps it up. We're going to have new NSRS modernization. It's on the horizon. We're going to have new models built on new technology. One of the things that we know is that the NAD 83, the North American datum of 1983, is not truly geocentric. It's about 2 meters off of the center of the mass of the Earth, and that's going to cause some problems with as our technology increases and we get better accuracies. Things are going to get to the point where they're not matching up. So we're going to be updating the NSRS hopefully we'll see something coming out next year, but it'll probably be 2026 before the new vertical datums come out. And one of the nice things about the new vertical datums is they're going to be based on gravity, and they're not going to be based on, like the Virgin Islands right now is based on sea level observations, and Puerto Rico is also based on sea level observations. But those sea level observations vary from one side of an island to another. So with the new geopotential measurements that we're going to be using for vertical datums, it's going to be a much better system, much more consistent. And that's about it. Any questions?
Thanks so much for the great presentation, Charlie. Appreciate it. This is definitely a part of NOAA that I really didn't know a whole lot about, so I hope folks on the line found this interesting and useful as well. We do have time for questions, so I'm going to open it up now to the group. You can also type questions into the chat. Okay.
I know I didn't do that great of a job that nobody has any questions about it, or maybe they just don't care, you know?
I think you care, Charlie. I think you just explained the content really well. We have a question from Molly. Oh, and Alyssa.
I came off mute. You can do Molly first. I'll come back to me.
Molly wants to know, is there a link to see the plate motions?
If you look at, I don't know that there's one specifically for any given plate. You can look at any of the CORS stations that we have, and you can see what the vertical velocity or the velocities are, horizontal and vertical velocities are. If you just go to our website, our CORS page, and find a CORS, there's, like I said, there were 40 of them throughout the region. And just find one of them, and it will give you the local velocities for that particular site.
Thanks, Charlie. And we got the question coming in from Alyssa. Alyssa, I'll read it for you. I'm curious how long it will take to update the NSRS. Is it over many years or a shorter time frame?
Well, we will provide the information, and it will be done in 2026. That's what we're shooting for. In 2025, we're going to have all of our products in beta, so they can be tested by the public, and we can review any comments or suggestions that a person might have. And then after that period, it'll be about 6 months. The national or the federal geospatial Federal Geodetic Control Subcommittee will vote on the new NSRS products, and once that's done, then they'll be available for use on our live web page, or live page. Yeah, it'll be 2026 probably before we get to the end of it. Now, how long it takes for other federal agencies to adopt that, generally they have, after it's been adopted, they'll have up to 5 years for the other federal agencies to adopt it, which isn't too bad considering that some of the federal agencies are still 2 datums behind, working with NGVD 27. Or 29 rather, NGVD 29. And since then, we've had 2 other vertical datums come out.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much for being here today and presenting on this work. We really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording for this part of our community group meeting.